What's up, theory creeps? Today we're going to be continuing our conversation about silence in Aqua Teen Hunger Force. For those of you who are just joining us, our last video was about the silence of the body and body horror in Aqua Teen. It's not required viewing for this video. I'm not going to be referring to it too much because while we're still talking about silence in Aqua Teen, we're not going to be talking about bodies this time around. Now we're focused on language. So, without further ado,
heads. A weaker man might be moved to re-examine his faith. If in nothing else, at least in the law of probability. Heads.
You obviously did not read the memo.
Is this your memo? I don't even know what this is!
No! You certainly with your lies.
One of the thieves was saved. It's a reasonable percentage. Go.
What?
Suppose we repented.
Repented what?
Oh, we wouldn't have to go into the details.
Our being born?
Thank you, Daddy.
You found it. That's your guest bedroom. And hey, if you need to go to the bathroom, just do it.
Shake.
Don't mess with him, okay? He's had a long day.
You need anything else? There's some ants.
Well, no questions, not a flicker of doubt. I could be wrong. No fear?
Fear.
Fear. 79.
what is an idiom? Google says that it's a group of words established by usage as having a meaning not deductible from those of the individual words. For example, it's raining cats and dogs, or she sees the light. These phrases are understood to not have any relation to the physical reality that they seem to describe. It's not raining cats and dogs, it's just raining heavily. But the speaker and the listener accept that the phrase's meaning is culturally and conditionally determined. Idioms refer only to themselves. There is no pretense of direct correspondence to material reality. We tend to assume that, most of the time, speech refers to reality, and rarely, such as in the case of the idiom, loses contact with the material world. Derrida wants us to consider that idioms may not be marginal to how language at large functions. Rather than the exception, idioms may be the rule, that language never refers to anything but itself. Few television shows are as idiomatic as Aqua Teen Hunger Force.
What do you mean, no? Don't you know how much this is for? Because I do not.
Look, we don't cash checks here.
Shake's words are totally unrelated to reality. His responses to the clerk have no connection to what the clerk is saying.
And we don't respond to threats?
But there was no threat. Just a statement. Shake is incapable of hearing what others say, because language is incapable of saying anything.
That's not a bill.
This is Cliff. Does anyone know a Cliff?
Yes. My name is Cliff, and that's not a bill. Tell him,
That's a bill.
A bill? Why are we trying to cash a bill,
Hell, I don't know. It's your uncle. I kept telling you on the way down
It
here.
is my uncle. Don't you forget
On the
it.
way down, I kept saying, this is a bill. Just figured you knew something I didn't.
I did know something I didn't.
The check is for an unknown amount. And the check is in fact a bill.
And maybe immigration would like to know about this.
Good, because you know what? I'm American.
Well, I'm not.
Immediately, the nature of the threat is reversed. Without notice or reason, Shake is now the one threatened with deportation.
But when I become one, maybe then I'll legally buy a weapon and we won't have to vote you out of office. Will we, scumbag?
His language is a series of signs with no subject of signification.
They sneak in, and then they try to rule us. Well, I'm going to sneak into your country and do this job there, and then not cash any of your friggin' checks!
So in our last video, we talked about how reason has kind of co-opted language and how language has really become a tool for determining rational truth. This kind of relegates silence to the realm of absurdity, and it also kind of marries absurdity and silence, like it silences absurdity. But, as was pointed out to me after someone watched my most recent video, there's lots of examples of insane, absurd speech in day-to-day life. If you just look at how couples fight, or if you look at how parents talk to babies, or pet owners talk to cats, every day in our daily lives we encounter speech that is essentially meaningless. And it's not what thinkers like Foucault or Derrida mean when they say that madness has been silenced. They're not speaking literally. They don't mean that the mad have been gagged or have had their tongues cut out. What Derrida was trying to do in his essay, Cogito and the History of Madness, and I think Foucault was trying to do something similar in A History of Madness and Civilization. They were trying to emphasize the inextricable bond that's formed since, Platonism and the classical era between rational truth and language. And this link between rational truth and language has robbed absurd language that doesn't conform to the expectations of a rational argument. It's robbed it of meaning. It doesn't let us access truth anymore because truth has been so thoroughly embedded in rational language. So the silence that Foucault and Derrida are talking about, it's not a literal silence, it's a poetic silence. It's a degrading of meaning. It's a placing absurd language under rational language. The problem is baked into the assumption that rational language is a way to access truth. When you assume that, you immediately subjugate irrational language as less authentic, as less true. And when you make this assumption and when you embrace this hierarchy, you're unable to enjoy and to get the therapeutic benefits of shows like Aqua Teen Hunger Force. So what does the speech in Aqua Teen actually look like? How do characters actually talk to each other in this show?
No, let's get down to it. What I say is very baffling.
Hey.
Well, they don't really. Talking to each other implies a level of connection and communication and an exchange of information. There's none of that going on in the discussions that occur in Aqua Teen. Characters constantly say something and then aren't heard. When one person responds to another, there's rarely any reference to what the first speaker actually said.
Bible.
The Bible? Yeah, I must have taken a look at it.
Do you remember the Gospels?
I remember the maps of the Holy Land. Colour they were. Very pretty. The Dead Sea was pale blue. The very look of it made me thirsty. That's where we'll go, I used to say. That's where we'll go for our honeymoon. We'll swim. We'll be happy.
You should have been a poet.
I was. Isn't that obvious?
What are you doing?
What do you think I'm doing? Paying the bills. I ain't got my blender to work all morning. I need me a weenie smoothie.
No, Meatwad. Shake's got to do it. He needs to learn a lesson about responsibility.
But you need to teach me a lesson about money. Look at this here. I was going to send this. No one works in the system that I use.
Why don't you just put all this back in your little pine straw bank?
Bank? No, that's my IRA. I use the bank, I get burned on capital gains tax.
If I asked you straight off, I'm going to stuff you in this box now. Would you rather be alive or dead? Naturally, you'll prefer to be alive. Life in a box is better than no life at all. You could lie there thinking, well, at least I'm not dead. In a minute, somebody's going to bang on the lid and tell me to come out. Hey, you! What's your name? Come out of there. I think I'm going to kill you.
The subject of conversations jumps around constantly.
Where was I? How's your foot?
Swelling visibly.
Ah, yes, 2 thieves. Do you remember the story?
No.
Shall I tell it to you?
No.
It'll pass the time.
I didn't think you'd do it, but you paid the bills.
Hell I pay no bills. I pay you no mind.
Well, I'm just glad that you finally accepted some responsibility in the most ass way possible.
There's very little reference to truth or very little attempt made to arrive at any kind of truth.
The law of averages, if I've got this right, means that if 6 monkeys were thrown up in the air long enough, they would land on their tails about as often as they would land on their heads. Getting a bit of a bore, isn't it?
Time chamber, go to past. Time chamber, go to past. Time chamber. I'm not saying that this is a refrigerator box, but this is totally a refrigerator box. Get out of the refrigerator, time chamber. I will go to the past and be the hero.
There's a fundamental kind of silence in the language of Aquatine. While the characters are constantly prattling at each other, there's no meaning in anything that they're saying, which is a way to speak without speaking. See, this is what I mean when I say that the silence that Derrida and Foucault were talking about isn't a literal silencing. The mad can still talk. It's just that we don't listen to them anymore. It's that there's nothing to hear when they speak. So as absurd as Aquatine is, there are methods to understanding the language in it. It's actually not as meaningless as it seems. If we look at Aquatine as part of the lineage of existential and absurdist plays, in Europe and North America since World War II, then we have access to this very large body of criticism with which to understand what's going on in Aquatine. So really what Aquatine is trying to do, Aquatine and Stoppard and Becket, they're trying to shake their language free of reason. They're trying to speak without rational intentionality. They're trying to undermine the possibility of expressing anything. Because if language doesn't express anything in these instances, it draws into question the possibility of it expressing anything in more rational settings. Okay, I want to very briefly look at a clip from Hamlet, because we're talking about Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, so I would be remiss if I didn't mention this one scene. What I want you to pay attention to while you're listening to my man Melly Gibson's speak in this scene is the dyad between seeming and being. So let her rip.
If it be, why seems it so particular with thee?
Seems, madam. Nay, it is. I know not seems. 'Tis not alone my inky cloak, good mother, together with all forms, modes, shapes of grief that can denote me truly. These indeed seem, for they are actions that a man might play. But I have that within which passes show. These but the trappings and the suits of woe.
So I think Shakespeare is being ironic here. Hamlet hasn't embraced being. Hamlet very much operates on the level of seeming, but that's a discussion for another day. Let's assume for a moment that Hamlet is being serious and that Shakespeare isn't undermining what he's saying. If he knows only being, he never seems, then Aquatine is the opposite of that. It knows only seeming, it never is. And this is a good thing. Surfaces are where meaning is, if you ask me. It's when you start to look for depth in things the way Hamlet does that you start to lose track of truth. So in this scene, Hamlet is kind of insulting performances, right? He's saying that everyone else seems to be in grief. I am in grief. And he says that what you see when you look at someone performing grief is but the trappings on the suits of woe. Trappings, accessories, visible things, suits, cladding, presentation. Hamlet is telling us that performance is lesser than reality, which is ironic because he ultimately uses a performance to uncover reality. So in Aqua Teen, all we get are the trappings on the suits of woe. There's so much pain and suffering in Aqua Teen, and it's all worn on the surface. And again, I think this is a good thing because that's where meaning dwells. Imagine someone who would cultivate the French language. What is called the French language? Someone whom the French language would cultivate, and who, as a French citizen, would be a subject of French culture. Now suppose that one day this subject of French culture were to tell you in good French, I have only one language, and it is not mine. Or rather, better still, I am monolingual. My monolingualism dwells, and I call it my dwelling, and I remain in it and inhabit it, and it inhabits me. The monolingualism in which I draw my very breath is my element, not a natural element, not the transparency of the ether, but an absolute habitat. It is impassable. I cannot challenge it except by testifying to its omnipresence in me. It would always have preceded me. It is me. This inexhaustible solipsism is myself before me, lastingly. Yet it will never be mine. This language, the only one that I am. This language, the only one that I am thus destined to speak, as long as speech is possible for me in life and in death. You see, never will this language be mine. And truth to tell, it never was. This is another example of absurd speech. Derrida's telling us that he only has one language, but it isn't his. How can you have something that isn't yours? It's a contradiction. But to go back to Hamlet, I think this may be a case of seeming and not being. What Derrida's doing is he's emphasizing the colonial nature of language. Language is an essential part of the colonization process. We move into a place, we remove people's language, we remove their cultural icons and their cultural practices, and then we enforce our language and make it illegal to speak their native language. This is a way to colonize the minds of a nation. Who said, if you want me to learn your language, you better have a gun? This colonial process isn't limited to geopolitics. We're all colonized by language. At some point in our lives, usually very early in our lives, but in the case of the deaf, that might not be true, we get language, or I guess you could say language gets us. Aqua Teen Hunger Force takes its language to this weird, anti-colonial, silent place. Sometimes. It's not always babbling and gibberish and non-meaningful, absurd dialogues. Sometimes there's this very real, quiet stillness to the show.
You're free now, Shake. Shake?
Moo!
Oh no, he's turned.
What does that mean? We won't get to bring him home, ain't we?
Meatwad, I think this is gonna have to be his new home from now on.
Moo! Moo! Moo!
Goodbye, son.
Now, we've been talking about how language provides a point of access to, like, material truth, to, like, the external world. But what about the internal world? How does language affect ourselves? Like, when we get language, or when we get got by language as a baby, like, what's that like? What happens there? What happens to our inner self? Well, language and culture is how we form ourselves. The stories we tell about ourselves are obviously linguistic, they're stories. The self-presentations we give to other people are based on language. We connect to the other and form ourselves in the eyes of the other using language, so it's a pretty big deal. And this is a colonial process too, right? As we form ourselves using this tool, using language, we're buying into these cultural notions that the language carries with it. Chiefly among them is that language equates to rationality. So this self that we form using language, it's not authentic, which is a weird word, and I don't mean to say that something else is authentic, but it's not. It's not real. We form ourselves using language, and language is this social construction that we're forced to use. If we associate originality with authenticity, then our original self, our pre-linguistic self, would have no idea what our linguistic self would look like. So that's the point Derrida's trying to make. This French person who only speaks French doesn't have French. French isn't their language. It was forced on them. If we want to know what's real, if we want to know what's original and true, then I think we have to look at deaf people who never learned to read lips or to sign.
Patrick Otema is 15 years old. He was born deaf, but in this remote region of northern Uganda, there are no schools for deaf children. In his whole life, Patrick's never had a conversation.
Hello. Good? This is pretty much Patrick's existence. His father gestures to him what he wants him to do, and when he's finished, he goes back to his hut to spend the rest of the day on his own.
Never been taught sign language. Unable to communicate with others, they are trapped in their own minds.
Just look in his eyes. That's the only real truth there is. This silent confusion. That's what's real. And it's not a thing. That's why I said I'm not presenting something as an alternative to linguistic authenticity. This isn't a thing. This is just an inky black abyss. Zen monks have a meditative ritual. A pupil sits in lotus position, and after closing their eyes and clearing their mind, they ask themselves, "Who am I?" After answering the question, they ask another, "Who is asking the question?" After answering the second question, they ask it again. The objective of this exercise is to peel the layers of the self back again and again until the pupil realizes that there is no essential, authentic center to their self, that they are just layers upon layers, and at the center is a black hole. But this isn't cause for alarm, for as Chang Tzu said, the perfect man has no self, the spiritual man has no achievements, the true sage has no name. All right, so if you're still watching, congratulations. You now have a clearer understanding of the impossibility of understanding anything in the postmodern world. And people tend to think that this perspective is all doom and gloom, that it's pessimistic and negative. And to be honest, that's a fair assumption. I mean, this position basically states that the only truth in our lives is an inky blackness that leaves us totally isolated and without any chance of understanding the world around us. In this perspective, we're pulled out of this warm, inky black womb-like abyss by a violent and colonial language that's foreign to us and then occupies us with its perspectives and political values. It sounds rough, right? But don't even trip, bro. It's cool. Just look at Patrick, right? Remember how dark his life was? Well, now he's got some language in it, and honestly, he looks a lot happier for it.
Raymond became deaf as a child after a bout of malaria. 6 months ago, he traveled to the capital for intensive training in sign language. A few minutes later, Patrick arrives. Before the end of the class, each new student goes to the front. The class votes on a new name for them. This is now Patrick's sign name, and he will use it for the rest of his life. He has just been baptized into a whole new world.
He's totally stoked to be talking, and obviously his life was a lot harder without language. And that doesn't make language any more true or meaningful, but it does make it useful. And I think this kind of pragmatic optimism is a good approach to writers like Derrida. Language isn't this rigid, structural, organized approach to truth. It's an opportunity to play. When we see language as idiom, when we see that language isn't rigidly connected to the material world, we have a lot more freedom to do what we want with it. And I think shows like Aqua are a fantastic example of the potentials of language when it's freed up from the need to be meaningful. Language is fundamentally a way to connect with one another, even if that's an impossibility, even if it never really happens, even with language, we're still kind of trapped within ourselves using this tool that's not of us. It's still better than nothing, and I think Patrick is a great example of that. So the next time you watch Aqua Teen, try to keep an eye out for this kind of silent language, for this absurd freedom that the show has. It's not just meaningless cartoon drivel. The language of the show is quite intentional and quite powerful. Anyway, that's it for me for this week. This has been The Theory Creep. I'm your Theory Creep. Over and out.